Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of In the Clouds with Red Hat Leadership here on OpenShift TV. We are joined today by the one and only, and recently promoted, so I have to actually look at my notes, Stefanie Chiras, Senior Vice President and General Manager of the Red Hat Enterprise Linux Business Unit. Congratulations on your promotion, first of all, long overdue.
Oh,
Uh, uh, and, and, and like, I can't tell you how excited I am to have you on today. So, welcome to the show. Welcome to the channel.
oh, thank
And
you. I
and
appreciate the opportunity. We've been chatting about being able to do this for a while, so I'm really glad to be here. Thank you.
thank you. So, let's kind of dive right in. You were at IBM for a while. You came to Red Hat before the acquisition. What kind
Yes.
of got you interested in Red Hat as opposed to, like, staying where you were and on your path at IBM?
Yeah, so that's I have a long history with
Hmm.
IBM. I had 17 years actually with IBM prior to deciding to make what is, I always say like I grew up at IBM because I started out in research division. I was out of a postdoc in academia. I had always been on this path in my life. I was going to live in academia and pursue a
Hmm.
career. And then I made a pivot shift and went to IBM research. And I come from a hardware background. So I started out there doing metallization deposition. And over the 17 years, moved from depositing metals and dielectrics
Wow.
on silicon chips up through chip design and system subsystem design, up through system characterization. And I was always in engineering and development. And then about the last 4 years, I switched over into a business role at IBM.
Hmm.
I was in IBM Power Systems at the time.
Hmm.
And my first business role was with Power 8. I had been on the chip design team and led a team in chip design on Power 8, which was the first power architecture chip that did little endian Linux.
Oh, wow.
So
Okay.
so we had been, yeah, it had always been big endian. And so
Yeah.
Power 8 was the first shift to little endian. And when it went over to go to market, they wanted to create a business of Linux on Power. And that was
Hmm.
my first business role. Like go off and lead Linux on Power, which was little endian for the first time. And so it was my background, of course, had never been really on the software side, and it
Right.
was a very educational experience. The thing that it put me in the role to be the liaison to Red Hat from the IBM system side.
Interesting.
And
Okay.
so I learned a lot about Red Hat, about their mission, but I also learned a lot about the value of community. Now, um, coming from power, having been in chip design for a long time, I have a real appreciation for the power of architecture and hardware and things. But now I was put in this space where the value of the community and community adoption, that's what mattered because customers wanted to run applications, applications were run on software, and now you were trying to figure out how to create this community of software. And an incredible appreciation it gave me for what it matters to be able to embrace a software community, have them find value, pull them onto the architecture. That combined with the visibility to the culture at Red Hat, how Red Hat worked, pulling all of that together made it very interesting for me to move into the Linux space. But it was a very interesting way to come in and find that appreciation.
That's yeah, like it's enlightening to hear that you have a very deep engineering background and you're in leadership here at Red Hat, right? Like that makes me
Yeah.
feel like I want to stay, right? Like as, someone with a technical background, that makes me feel like this is the right place for me, right? So it's very good to hear that story and to let the world know that, like, the person that's leading the Red Hat Enterprise Linux business actually has been on the ground trying to get Linux, like, installed in data centers and actually out there, right?
Yeah.
Like, because that's not always a skill that people that make that senior VP level, like, have, right? Like, they don't have that in the field experience sometimes.
And it
And
was very interesting because you were at a very unique time on architecture that
right.
people didn't appreciate. And I went from this world where being on that power side where you had you had an OS and you had a hypervisor all built on
Hmm.
that hardware. If if there was an issue in the chip, or if there was something that, you called up the BIOS team or the firmware team and you said, hey, we got something we need your help with, and you could leverage the whole stack,
Yeah.
in order to pull that together. And in the world of Linux and community, you don't have that option. Um, you really have to get the buy-in of the community. So it was a very interesting education for me.
Yeah, I bet. Right. Like the amount of yeah, the amount of time it takes to get something into the kernel, I can't imagine how long it takes something to get in the hardware. Yeah. So so RHEL has been at the core of our product portfolio for literally decades, right? Like, I mean, I can't believe how old Red Hat is, given that, like, I remember Red Hat when it went like IPO, like back in 2000, right? Like,
Yep.
it's gone by so fast. How is Red Hat adjusting to the times of smaller workloads spread out across more diverse hardware, right? Like, we're still on power, but now we're on all this other kind of hardware, right? Like we've got like SMC chips that we support and all kinds of weird, fun, stuff that we
Yeah.
put Linux on nowadays. And how does that like just flood of hardware and the change in the world of like moving towards edge? How is that impacting RHEL and what we're doing every day?
So I think it's such an interesting time, and it's a pull in of what's happening in the industry, but also what we have been doing in Red Hat. When I look at why I was so excited, and to take the RHEL role, and why I love this role every day, is because I view the RHEL business as two things. It is a product for sure. It
Mhm.
has a commitment to customers. It has a roadmap to deliver, but that is RHEL, the product. In addition, RHEL is a technology, right? It is a technology that feeds into OpenShift, and it's a technology that feeds into OpenStack as the base Linux for those things. And we have responsibilities to the company and the market in both, and we have
Mhm.
to we have to balance those two things. So I love that kind of combination of the responsibility and the balancing of that it has to have. Now you layer onto that, in both of those dynamics, you're looking at what's happening in the industry. um, Things in the industry around now, coming from my architecture background, right? I love
Right.
the fact that diverse architectures have a role to play. I think there is value in architecture. I think the ability that Linux has brought to the world is the ability to make that simple to consume. So all the
Hmm.
magic that's happening, whether it be in ARM, whether it be in Power, whether it be in x86, whether it be in a SmartNIC, whether it be,
Right.
NVIDIA
Yeah.
GPUs, right? Accelerators, FPGAs. You pull all of that fantasticness, but who can create, right? How do you access all of that for when you pick and choose it for the applications you run? That's where Linux starts to become an equalizer. But it's an equalizer not just technically, but it's an equalizer from the community and the ecosystem that it supports. Like, we don't just deliver technology and bits, we deliver a ecosystem that we have worked with to make sure that it all builds upon one another. So now, as you look at what's happening in the edge space, which you brought up, which I think
Right.
is a fascinating place to look at, I'd say there's two things that are happening. The architecture that has been used in the data center, as data becomes kind of the real key driver for differentiation, and that
Yeah.
data is being pulled out from the outskirts and wherever that's coming in, sensors, whatever, there is a,
Cars,
yeah,
phones. Yeah.
every place, right? I mean, it's like, where is the right point to start to aggregate that? Now, clearly,
Hmm.
we're not focused on doing your little tiny sensors, but those sensors are pulling in data. That data needs to be aggregated and analyzed at some point before the data center. And there is that edge case, right? That is really, really important. It has to be stable. It has to be easy to update. It has to live in many cases for a long life cycle, right? 10 years, right? It's a bit of a, many places in this edge is a set it and forget it kind of mentality. So this is a place where RHEL plays really well. And I think as it becomes more specialized out there, things like ARM, things like accelerators, all of that plays a different role. What we have done in the data center to sort of equalize and provide that more level playing field to that hardware and the stability and security, plays just as well, is equally important when you move out to the edge. And most folks who are going to run edge are running core data center. So now you can
Right.
bridge that capability in the data center out to the edge. So that consistency plays a big role. I think the other pivot point, that the second point that we're seeing in this industry trend, which is super interesting, is, there is a period of time when something is new that you can sustain uniqueness,
Right.
right? Like if there's a one company who's going out to the edge and they want to deliver an appliance for a period of time, they may choose to go after creating their own operating system because that makes sense for them. Over time, as that market matures, as that perhaps industry vertical matures, um, right, sustaining your own operating system is likely not a good use.
Yeah.
Also, it doesn't provide the ability to leverage the communities upstream. So we're seeing a pivot in this edge space, in the embedded space, where there is a thirst for some amount of standardization, where they can get access to an innovation cycle. So what we had done for the data center years and years ago is now start that edge space is starting to mature in many industry verticals, where they're like, listen, I can't see a sustainable model where I'm going to have a custom OS. I need something
Right.
that I can count on that is going to be. And so we're having a lot of interesting discussions in the market, with partners around that space. But I think those are kind of the two things that are happening. But I love the fact that different architectures are starting to be used out there, right? Because
It's
provides a
fun.
it's so fun, right? And it
It's
provides a whole
awesome.
new level to change the game. I mean, you look at the Fugaku announcement, right? Number
Mm.
one on the supercomputing list, built on ARM for the first time ever,
Right.
and it's running RHEL. So that is just, and HPC world has changed
Hmm.
so much. It's now, aggregations of small systems, but boy, that provides a whole new opportunity to take architectures, use them. It becomes a horses for courses.
Right.
You can pick the architecture you need and you can still use the same Linux. That's a beautiful thing.
Right. And and I didn't appreciate the term edge until I joined Red Hat, right? Like I didn't see it as a real thing until I realized that, like, holy smokes, we're putting an OS in a vacuum cleaner, that runs around my office every night and cleans up the place, right? Like we're putting OSs in places where we never thought we would put OSs before, toasters and things like that. But not that RHEL's going to land on your toaster. RHEL's going to help you get standard, right? Like what I tell people is, you're not in the XYZ business, you're in the robot making business, or you're in the widget making business. You're not in the custom OS business, right?
Right.
Like where does um our, like, app stream model and containerization and RHEL and all that fun stuff help us with the edge? How does that help us, not just with the edge? Like let's talk about
Yep.
that a little bit.
I mean, I think it comes down to our, certainly my goal is to look at how do we take that standardization value and the expertise that we have in Linux and pull that out to the edge, which to me, I kind of view it as like distributed data center. To
Hmm.
a large degree, right, where we're going is this data center has expanded out because it is trying to get closer to the data, which makes perfect sense. The use cases, however, are different out there. Many times it's much lighter weight. Many times you want to be able to deploy the operating system, have it update in a atomic way, right? Have it update, roll back if you need it to roll back.
Yes.
We're learning a lot. And this is a place where our model in the community has really paid off, right? Fedora IoT, which is a very active SIG, is a
Hmm.
place where we've gotten a ton of insight on what people want in this world. It is very active. Customers are looking at it. They're providing us feedback on it. So, if you look at our development model, Fedora IoT as a SIG has been very helpful for us. We talk to customers, but we do have to figure out how we take the standardization capabilities we've done in the data center, pull that out to the edge, and tailor it for the use case of how it wants to be used. How does it get updated? What are the architectures that are being used? There is rapidly changing things out there. Likely magic of how to deploy an application via a container provides
Mm,
a very simple way to deploy out there. It could be one container, it could be unorchestrated, it could be a very simple deployment, but that's a place where running a container on your operating system works really well. You can also then, of course, run OpenShift back home, be able, I mean, there's just so much
yeah.
magic in that hybrid type of deployment. Now, things like app streams, which you mentioned, I think we in the RHEL space, in order to be make sure we stay relevant, have looked at um, kind of two things in the operating system that we want to make sure we're driving forward. One is, as the world gets more complicated, as footprints like edge become more prevalent, as architectures start to broaden, um, what do we provide in our standardization capability to really keep operational efficiency capabilities, right? Because our goal is to provide that sort of that layer that um, delivers operational efficiencies, so you don't have to redevelop, redo everything every time you deploy a new architecture or in
Yeah.
a new
Like,
footprint, right?
no one wants to do that.
No, and no one wants to rebuild stuff they've been running for the last 8, 10 years.
Right.
So
Or the last 10 months. Who can, right? Like,
so someone I was talking to a customer just a couple of weeks ago, and they made that comment. We used to talk about legacy as being what I was running 5 years ago. Now, if I'm running it for 12 months, I
it's
view it as
legacy.
legacy. Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, it's just a whole different mindset.
It's a world
Yeah,
like sea change of like what we view as, technological advancement, right? Like it's just rapidly
absolutely.
accelerated.
And so that brings up kind of this next the other kind of half of the coin that we are focused on in RHEL is, how do we make sure that RHEL is providing access to the next layer of innovation? And to me, app streams is exactly that. No longer is the only way to deploy your operating system in a monolithic way, right? Your user packages may need to be updated. You may need to be able to access multiple versions of a package in a user space.
Hmm.
And that's what app streams brings, right? It provides that capability of access to innovation at the modularity, at the package level in your user space that really makes sense. And so I'd say, as we look, we assess everything we're trying to do with how do we do operational efficiency, and never compromise on giving access to innovation. App streams is exactly one of those spots.
Right.
So is the container deployments that you talked about. We put the container tools of Build a Podman, Scopio directly into RHEL exactly for the
Hmm.
same reason, right? It was to make sure that the operating system provided that first step into that world of innovation. And while clearly it doesn't provide things like Kubernetes orchestration, et
Right.
cetera, that's what OpenShift does. It at least provides that first step.
Yeah, and I think it's valuable to point out here that RHEL is kind of the foundation for everything in OpenShift too, right? Like
Yeah.
a lot of the things that we got from Core OS were paired up with the things we do in RHEL to make Red Hat Core OS Linux, right? Like that operating system and all the innovation behind it is what has driven all this innovation lately. So having it all based on RHEL, I feel like has got to feel like a big win for you, right? Like it's has to feel like a big responsibility as well, right? Like you have a lot of people you're serving now with all these containers, with all these microservices, and
We do.
keeping those things updated is very hard, which kind of leads me into the next question. And there was some big news announced this morning. IBM is spinning off their managed services unit into its own whole business. And we look at managed services in a way, and IBM looks at managed services in kind of a different way. And I'm curious how you think that move is going to impact us in any way, shape, or form, or how the view of how we see things differently and interacting with that new company will be experience wise for us.
Yeah, so let me talk through that a bit, because I think as you alluded to, right, the term managed services, it's like it's like 5 years ago when someone said cloud, right? It was like, well,
Right.
what do you
Yeah.
really mean? Even like a year ago, they're like, well, I say edge. Well, what do you really mean when you say
Right.
edge? I think when we say managed services, this is one of those spots that we should talk through too. So GTS, or Global Technology Services at IBM,
Mhm.
has long been a business that has been driven around really managing data centers. So they have been able to offload, and there's a ton of their customers who rely on them to take ownership really of their data center, manage a workload within a GTS owned data center, and they'll do both. But it's very much data center driven. So when they say managed services, it's heavily about the data center. How are they running it on behalf of a customer? Um, Quite different than what we think of like a managed service, like if OpenShift dedicated, which
Right.
we can term as a as a managed service, but it's a platform as a service, right? And is how I would term it, right? Very different than what they're doing.
Mhm.
We have been involved with GTS. I mean, I know myself, my team, we have
Right.
been involved with GTS for a long time. Now, there's a couple of specifics, right, to dive into that announcement a little bit. So GTS was kind of the big business unit at IBM. A couple of those um, portions of that will stay with IBM. So TSS, I think it's
Mhm.
technical support services, that will stay. Red Hat has had a long-standing relationship with TSS because they provide things like maintenance. They predominantly drive things with, when I had power systems, you could purchase RHEL through IBM on your power system when you purchase the server, right? Because we had that partnership with IBM. TSS provided kind of the lead on delivering that to a customer.
Interesting.
So
Okay.
technical support services was heavily involved in IBM systems for when Red Hat products came in with your IBM system.
Mhm.
TSS was very involved, and that will remain with IBM. So
Right.
that sort of linkage doesn't get broken.
No change. Yeah,
No, no
which is
change.
great. Yeah, yeah,
And I think as far as the managed services around GTS, like managing your data center, in fairness, we have been working with them as a partner for a long time,
yeah.
even since the acquisition, right? We're just over a year into the acquisition closure, and we still work with them as a partner.
Yeah. Mhm.
So my view on that is, and it's been interesting. I work with GBS, Global Business Services, over at IBM, and GTS, and there's linkages there. GBS will deliver to customers leveraging the capabilities of GTS. So this sort of partnership model of how we work together has been in place forever. I think
Mm.
having them be a new company, quite honestly, is just like having a new partner.
Right.
It's not really going to change, in my opinion. Um, we'll continue to work with them as a partner, like we work with a lot of other partners in the industry. So I, it didn't, it didn't really change when the acquisition went through how we work
Right.
with GTS. We worked with them as a partner. I think that'll continue. So I think it's an interesting move from IBM to do this. I think it allows GTS to focus on what they do. It allows IBM to focus on their GBS services business. So, but from our perspective at Red Hat and the day-to-day work that I do and my linkages with GTS and
Right.
GBS
Right.
and IBM, it doesn't really change.
Yeah.
Um,
And I think that that goes to our model, right? Like of how we help people, right? Like how we do our business is, very open and standardized and very kind of just, like this isn't going to change anything. And it's much like the IBM acquisition. Yeah, a couple knobs and dials got switched, but that's it, right? Like there wasn't a huge sea change, but it made a tremendous impact, right? Like we can see already the impact that the IBM acquisition is having with, our literally every deal we've closed. You just read the news. But the coolest thing to me about this is that it shows a renewed focus on what we're doing day to day here at Red Hat,
yeah,
right? Like that, I think, is what's coolest to me about the announcement. So,
I think it really highlights the hybrid cloud, right?
right.
And I think that's one of the things as you listen through. And I think Red Hat, even from the day the acquisition was announced, that hybrid cloud kind of what IBM was looking for from Red Hat to really
Hmm.
strive toward that hybrid cloud. this provides this is even amplified now with this announcement, and I think you can see that in all the news feeds and what Arvind has been stating.
Yeah, yeah. No, Arvin seems incredibly excited
Yeah.
about the move. So yeah, all the statements I've read so far. So I'm looking at our list of questions here. So containers are a first class citizen in the Linux kernel kind of deal, and we're starting to see them become part of a like packaging ecosystem of some sort. How do you see containers becoming like packages in the future, like in the RHEL 9-10 days, right? Like, how do you see that kind of container motion impacting future releases and potentially, like package management in general?
I mean, I think the modularity, right? If you look at the application space, the modularity and the technology of containers has been in Linux for ages, right?
Mm,
I think what the container craze, so to speak, right, of what's going on right now is showing people the power of what it can do for applications. Not only simplification of how you deploy an application, but the consistency. A lot of the customers I
yeah.
talk to, they're like, listen, I'm not so worried about breaking down my my applications into microservices. I get that. But
Yeah.
what I really love about the container aspect that they tell me is that like I can package it once, I send that out to all of the lines of business. I know that's how they're going to run it. When
Hmm.
I need to change it, I send them a new one, right? And they blow the other one up and they roll it out. So that level of consistency is very important. And we're seeing a lot of there is the packaging value, and then there is the kind of capability value. And both of those are important. I think at the application layer and at the microservices layer, that is driving the ecosystem today. I think there is more to learn about what we will do going forward, right? How that modularity value and that consistency capability starts to move into other areas. It's certainly something that we talk about and we're watching.
Nice.
And we don't, coming back to a bit about the application streams, right? Application streams breaks up that monolithic deployment into being able to pull different major versions of your user space package.
Right.
I think moving forward, right, watching how we can continue to build upon kind of the magic of that modularity is something that we're very interested in.
Yeah, I work in the OpenShift unit, so I deal with containers all the time,
Yeah.
and I keep reminding people that if it weren't for System D, if it weren't for the Linux kernel, like we wouldn't be
Yep.
in this position that we're in right now. And
Yep.
it's it's very refreshing to see like people talking about syscalls like when I talk to them about security, right? Like
Yeah.
that's really cool, right? Like we're getting it now, right? Like we
Yeah.
we have now reached this point where the Linux kernel is becoming something we all understand and something we all have to figure out, how do I keep these things from happening to the kernel on my hypervisor, on my virtualization or orchestration system for containers, the whole nine yards. So, if I
You know,
go
the
ahead,
point,
sorry.
no, because the point you're making right now is really, really important because I think we are pivoting in the container dynamic that's being talked about in the industry from like, the magic of containers, and you don't have to worry about anything else. Just get your
Mm,
container deployed anywhere
yeah,
into
no,
what
there's a lot to
really
worry about.
there's a lot to think about. And it started out that people were like, well, if I run a container, I don't have to worry about the operating system. And
Hmm.
actually, as you know, right, you got to worry about it a lot more, right?
More,
The
yeah.
way the operating system gets deployed is much more complicated even than it was in your VM space. So the points that you're making in that level of maturity that is being realized is actually very important for us because we want to make sure that, as you said, the stability and the ecosystem that we deliver with RHEL, and now we translate into RHEL Core OS on behalf of OpenShift, that value translates over. But the operating system becomes perhaps less visible in a container-driven world, but it is perhaps more important. And how we
Yeah.
sort of bridge that, I mean, I don't know if you're seeing the same thing when you talk to folks, but are they starting to I think that level of understanding is starting to come through now in folks who are deploying more complex container deployments.
Yeah. So we've, in my career, we've gone from, hey, I need a node running, Docker to, hey, I need a fleet of nodes running like containers. Help me, So
Yeah.
it's it's interesting to see when people are like, okay, I just want containers everywhere. I don't care about the OS. Well, it's like, well, wait a minute. Are you sure about that? Because if you do that, if you do a system where it's like the OS is different everywhere, how do you secure those workloads uniformly? How do you apply, pod security policies and system security policies in a uniform way across that entire fleet of all these devices? And I think that goes back to the edge as well, right? Like you have to have some standard foundation to build upon, and RHEL being that standard, Linux being that standard is where we are in the world. I feel like RHEL is the top performing, or whatever the right phrase. Sorry, legal and marketing. The right phrase is for RHEL,
Yep.
and its position in the market. It's amazing to me to see how quickly people have pivoted back to like, oh, wait a minute, that kernel does matter. Oh, wait a minute, that operating system is going to impact my business operations, right? Like, or my technical operations based upon lifecycle management of those systems, because Kubernetes deploys every quarter, right? Like
Yeah.
you've got to manage that and an operating system on top of that. That's really hard,
Yeah.
right? Like, and a lot of people do go out to a service, and you can get OpenShift dedicated now, just like you can, like EKS, XKS, all the other KS is out there, and people are like, well, why would I do that versus just using the cloud thing? And I have a funny thing on Twitter that I do. It's like, today in when you don't own your control plane, uh, like when people are like, hey, I've got this weird problem, blah 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 blah. It's like, well, it's because this. And sorry, it's
Yeah.
like Amazon has to change that for you, right? Like, so, as a developer, why am I going to get that subscription to RHEL to create that standardization, right? Like, what is motivating me as a developer to say, I need this standard?
I think I think the point you're making is a bit about it. It's amazing what mission critical workloads and scale drives, right? I mean,
Yeah.
that pivots kind of a mindset. And if you want to be able to land there, you kind of got to start thinking that way from the beginning. To your point on Linux, so in 2018, Linux surpassed Windows as the most deployed operating system in the world,
Hmm.
and then RHEL, of course, has a really great position in the market for the paid Linux space. But the point that makes about the Linux deployment at large is that that's what applications are being built on. That's what AI is built on. That's what machine learning. That's what the frameworks are being built in. That's what the tools are being built on. So there is clearly a path to say Linux is the place to start your development, because that's where the workloads are being built. That's how they're being deployed. So right from day one, having that Linux development spot is critically important. Because no one wants to rewrite, and to your point, no one wants when you have to ask for a change, right? You don't want to have to go back and ask Microsoft to make a change for you in your
Right.
Windows. So I think there's kind of a baseline decision that gets made that Linux is where it's at, right? It's where the innovation is being done. It's what applications being built on. Now you move to kind of the developer aspect of it, of how much do you prepare. We clearly understand that simplicity of access is key,
Yeah.
right? For a developer, it's like, God, what can I get my hands on that matters? Like, I don't want to have to be held up at the starting line. How do
Hmm.
I just plain get started? And this is something that we have been focused on to try and make sure that we move into. So we, for several years now, and actually, hopefully it's not a secret or a surprise to anyone, we have been really focused on making sure that we have RHEL developer subs, right? They
Yeah.
are available for free. They're focused on, making sure individual users can get access and for with simplicity to starting to do their development on RHEL, so that then when it lands, they know it can land in a production and deployment, et cetera. So we want to make sure that we are offering that simple access, that no cost access to folks, um, and driving that forward. I think there is real there is real merit in being able to plan ahead for the success of what you want to do in deployments, because at some point the developer and the line of business meet the operations team.
Right.
And and how do you kind of bridge that? And I think it's a bit of a reach over the fence from both sides. I
Hmm.
think we can see that with Kubernetes deployments today, right? How do you take what I've built on a in a container, and how does that land with the ops team who's going to be um, asked to maintain this for the
Actually,
long
like
term?
running this thing. Yeah.
Yeah, and doing audits on the security and the compliance and all of that. So we want to be able to be there to provide a, simple access, self-supported, development only subscription, easy to access. And in addition, right, I mean, clearly the Fedora community is providing a ton of focus on that as well, and provides a whole nother space for folks to participate in. So I
Yeah.
think between Fedora and then coming into the dev subs, we're looking to try and make that easier for folks.
Yeah, and I don't think people realize like how much work we do in Fedora that lands in RHEL because it's been tried out in the Fedora community so much, right? Like the changes that are being like evolving and rapidly taking place in Fedora, those eventually get tried and trued and land in RHEL at some point in time sometimes. Like I think what was it? Cockpit, I think was a great example
Yep.
of that, right? Like how it started in Fedora and was like, oh my gosh, this is going to change system administration for lots of people. This is going to be great. To now it's in RHEL and like it's actually changing system administration for people in the data center and far and wide. It's
I,
pretty cool, like to see it happen.
it's super cool. In fact, it was funny because just a few weeks ago, I took my car into the shop to get service, and I had on my RHEL jacket
Hmm.
and my red hat, and I think I was like, oh, I run Fedora on my on my
That's
laptop. I'm like,
awesome.
that's so cool. He's like, yeah, my sister turned me on to it. It's great. So I was
It's
actually super
amazing.
excited that someone bridged it, but it was really kind of neat. But the point that you make, we bridge a lot of that from Fedora, and I think you'll see the
Yeah.
same thing with Fedora IoT special interest group, right? That'll help
Mhm.
feed into what we do for the edge and how we drive that into the edge. The other piece, the other piece that maybe is of interest is, Fedora sits kind of upstream, right? Really, for
Yeah.
those developer folks, we have RHEL here. What we've done fairly recently, well, in 2019, was we announced CentOS Stream, which
Mm.
sits in the middle, right?
Mhm.
So that sits between the Fedora upstream and RHEL, and provides a bit of a faster iteration loop for folks who are looking to see what's coming next and develop on top of RHEL, but get visibility to that early. So I think we're definitely focused on making sure that that pipeline of what's being done in Fedora, what's being done in CentOS Stream feeds into RHEL and drives that ecosystem, both kind of flourishes the community, but also helps influence it. We do a
Yeah.
ton of work with our partners in Fedora. It's
Yeah.
unbelievable.
Yeah. No, I have a friend on the Fedora team who I'm constantly like, this is so cool. When is this landing in RHEL? It's really neat.
It is
And
neat.
Fedora drives this channel, right? Like we're using Fedora right now to stream the actual stream like it's coming out of a Fedora box. So it's a great operating system. I really love it. And it just gets better with time. So, what is the next big thing in your opinion for operating systems in general, right? Like, what is they're not a commodity. We're starting to realize what is the next big thing.
Yeah, I hear this word commodity, right, associated with an operating system now and then, and I think I mean, really, the definition of a commodity is, right, price is the only thing that matters, and there's no
Mm,
differentiation. And I think when you live in the world of open source, um, the bits are open source, right?
right.
I mean, the bits are out there, but the value is in the value is in the ecosystem or the partners and the hardware and all the certifications and all the work that's gone in to making sure that all of those bits work, and that, you stand behind it at the end of the day, and all the other values of, making sure that you have a life cycle that you can count on dependability. So there's all of that bit. The thing that I find mostly about an operating system that to me it makes it absolutely not a commodity is many of the things we talked about, Chris, around being that kind of leveler to get access to innovation, to move to the edge when someone needs to move to the edge for those deployments, or deploy an application at the edge or a container at the edge. Um, all of that means that the choice you make in your operating system is a very strategic decision,
Yeah.
right? It's going to, because it's strategic both for what I deploy today, for what I'll deploy next year, three
Right.
years from now, how secure it'll be, how stable it'll be. And the minute it's a strategic decision, it's not a commodity, right?
Right.
And that's the piece that I hold to, that like, hopefully it's simple. Hopefully the thing just works and you don't
Mm-hmm.
have to be playing with it every day and fiddling with it every day. But that does not a commodity make, right? It's
No.
still a
Yeah.
really strategic decision that you're making.
I don't maintain my corn supply. No, I just buy it and consume it, right? Like,
Like,
like that's a
yeah,
commodity, right? Like
yeah,
the idea that like, oh yeah, the OS doesn't matter, I think is just like, okay, fine. If the OS doesn't matter, then what are you running on top of it that does matter, right? Like,
and how that runs matters, but what operating system you're
right.
running
And how are
on,
you going to
right?
run that 3 years from now? Right.
Exactly.
Like, because what you put into production today might be there 5 years from now. You don't know what
Yeah,
business decisions. Who would have thought COVID, at the beginning of last year would have changed everything that's changed today? You don't know
totally
what your
agree.
code's going to do 5 years from now. You don't know where it's going to be landing, which kind of ties into something we talked about yesterday on the new RHEL show we have here on the channel, the new release cycle for Red Hat Enterprise Linux, right? Like, I'm excited about it because like I can actually open up a calendar and plan my upgrades. Like, what drove us to that decision? Was it literally so that our architects out there could open up a calendar and
It,
plan their upgrades?
it
Or
was absolutely customer request,
wow,
right?
okay, cool, yeah,
Customers came in and they said, listen, your 7 and 8 schedule,
yeah,
right? I didn't know what was coming. I didn't know when to plan for my updates. I was waiting to hear from you guys. So
mm,
we came in with a very structured way so that they could plan, but that was absolutely a customer request, and the feedback from customers has been great,
yeah,
right? To your point, now they can plan, they can predict. I can tell you it takes a bit of navigation in the ecosystem,
mm-hmm,
because now we're working with all our partners, whether they be chip partners, whether they be server partners. We have to work with all of them in order to, but we have put a stake in the ground to what we are doing, and now it's a matter of figuring out how we partner and pair and give and take around that. But the feedback has been great, incredibly valued to customers.
yeah,
I think I think coming to your point about kind of what's next for the operating system, it ties to that point, because there are three spots that I really see the ecosystem, or I'm sorry, the value of an operating system, like what's next.
mm,
Make sure that our partnerships remain relevant. That is number one. So
right,
things like this kind of consistent deployment, that's important for us, because now we're partnering with the public clouds. We partner with NVIDIA, we partner with
yeah,
all of these partners that are all over the place. And we
mm,
have to make sure that we have a framework in place that allows us to partner with the next startup that's going to come down the pipeline, or, kind of
the
the
next world changing thing that happens. Yeah,
exactly, right? So
exactly. Yeah,
so how do we stay relevant as that whole world of ISBs and hardware deployments and all of
mm,
that continues? I think the second piece ties to how do we continue to drive operational efficiency within the operating system. So we announced insights. I'm sure they talked about the inclusion
oh
of
yeah,
insights in the
yeah, yeah,
roadmap. So this is one of the things that I was super excited about when we launched it in 2019.
mm-hmm,
So we pulled in insights capabilities into every subscription available, right? So if you have a supported sub for RHEL, you have access to insights,
yep,
but it is coming back to that managed service piece, right, that you talked about earlier. It is
mm,
our way of providing an as a service capability that takes Red Hat knowledge, expertise, not only what we knew yesterday, but what we will know next month and what we'll know in 3 months. It provides us a way to provide that expertise into your data center as part of your operating system subscription. So if we start to see an issue bubble up with, when this config runs in this
Right.
way with this application, we start to see that bubble up. We can proactively tell you if you're linked up to Insights, listen, we've seen this cause trouble for
Yeah.
others, right? Take a look at this. That type of relationship that is personalized throughout the length of the sub, to me, is super exciting.
Yeah.
So Insights is great to me.
Insights is really amazing, and I tell the story every time Insights is brought up. John Spinks told me about a customer experience where they deployed Insights on like a percentage, right? Like it was like 1 or 2% of their fleet, right? They were like,
Yep.
okay, we'll turn it on, we'll test it, we'll see what it does for us. But they happened to turn it on one of their database servers, right? Just to get, some
Yep.
sampling. And that database server has had problems with restarts for months. And they've been working with the database vendor for months to try and figure out the problem. They turned on Insights. The next morning, they got the report. Hey, by the way, this kernel has a problem with this version, like this specific like point release of the kernel has the problem with this specific point release of the database. They found that out after months of trying to fix it, all by turning on Insights, right? And what you get with Insights is amazing. It's
Uh,
it's
it,
our
it's
knowledge.
it is. It's our knowledge. And I'm a huge fan of the subscription model that we run, because to me, a subscription is a relationship, right? That
Yeah,
relationship should get better as you go forward. And
right.
Insights will get better, right? As you move forward
Yes.
in that subscription length. And so that to me is huge value. And then you start to link that up to other things like Ansible playbooks that are built to
Mhm.
remediate those issues. Insights gives you awareness. You decide how to implement the remediation, but you pull that into things like Insights. It's super powerful.
Yeah.
And we've done even things like the systems roles, which they probably talked about, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
We actually took Ansible and put some playbooks in for
Mhm.
system roles directly into the operating system. So I
Which
think
I love, by the way. I mean, it's great.
it's great. So I think there's a lot more that we can do within the operating system in these new novel ways, whether it be through, cloud.redhat.com and providing new
Mhm.
capabilities in that way, pulling in new capabilities from Ansible. But I kind of view that as like, how do we take what is traditionally thought of as your operating system and kind of blow it out one level and
Right.
give you access to your first step into the foray of management and automation, of
Mhm.
having as a service operational assistance, as well as one step into containerization with things like Build-A-Podman and Scopio, right? That's
Right.
one step forward. It gets you ready for when you need to move into orchestration and Kubernetes with things like OpenShift. So I think there is, we got to maintain a partnership set and a relationships and an ecosystem that is really relevant today. But there's a lot of work we need to do to make sure that that continues going forward, because the world is changing.
Yeah, like there's going to be a system profile for NVIDIA GPU nodes soon, right? Like, I
Yeah.
mean, it's going to
Yep.
happen, right? Like, I mean, it's inevitable, right?
Yep.
We're going to start doing very specific. Like, NVIDIA just released like what they call it the DPU data processing unit,
Yep.
where the chip is on the actual network device. It's like, whoa, that's mind blowing, right?
Yeah.
Like, there's going to be more and more situations like this where the compute layer becomes different, and it's like a subset, right? Like we have we have security chips inside our computers. Now we have, it's not just the BIOS anymore. There's all these extra pieces that are
Yep.
built into the server that actually do a bunch of the stuff that actually keeps it stable and secure and running and online, and it's all software. But there's tons that the OS can tie into too.
So much. And I think there's this sometimes belief, like when you hear the word standardization, that it like limits innovation.
Right.
And I view operating system and what we're trying to do in RHEL is actually exactly the opposite. We're trying to
Hmm.
provide a level of standardization to make sure that you can access all the innovation.
Right.
And I think that ties exactly. I was talking to someone actually last week on this. I really think it is a bit of a lesson too that is mirrored in what we see in the open source communities, right? You have all of these projects going on. They could all be doing amazing innovation, but if they all went in different directions, and didn't have like interfaces to make sure that they could work and build upon one another and
Right.
have standardization of the boundaries, like OCI compliance, as an example.
Mhm.
Without those kinds of standardization, the innovation starts to go off in different directions and becomes very hard to implement. So there is a layer to this standardization that is actually improving us accessibility to innovation, and that's where I see RHEL plays a role. And that innovation could be happening in the hardware chip. It could be happening in, a new public cloud capability. It could be happening in
Right,
containerization
right,
on
right.
the edge. But how do we provide a similar to
Stepping
what
stone. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah. And I think it's very similar to how why the open source world is a self-sustainable innovation engine. It's because it has certain well thought through standardization aspects to it
Mm.
that don't impede innovation, but actually help it build upon one another.
Yeah, and it was the whole DevOps movement, I think, too, that like, oh, we're going to standardize and that's going to help us move faster. But wait, if we standardize, that's going to wait, what? Right? Like, no, like going fast actually improves speed and technology. We've proven, and, like changing things like app streams, I think is the perfect example of this, right? Like we
Yep.
understand that you're going to need to have, Postgres 9, 6, 10, and 12 all in this life cycle of RHEL 8, right? Like we
Yep.
get it, you'll want 13 and you'll want 14. And, that might be on RHEL 8, that might be on RHEL 9, but it's going to be there for you in the future. And having that there, having that standard foundation, which you can secure and manage and standardize across your entire fleet of servers and hosts, because there's metal somewhere, is a very, very big deal to me.
Yeah.
And that entry level stuff that we're doing to help people dive deeper is what this channel is all about, right? Like, so we take those tools that are built into RHEL and kind of help people understand, like, where does that get started, right? Like in the Level Up Hour show, we talk about Podman and Spokio and Builda, and how we build up to that Kubernetes stack. And we've been going through it for a few weeks, and Podman's been a huge part of that journey. And it's just so cool to see like our commitment to containers in the OS. And it's like, okay, yes, you can still do it with just RHEL. You can
Yep.
install and manage it through Cockpit if you want, right? Like, you don't have to go full blown, Kubernetes orchestrator if you just need to run a few containers. You can still do that with RHEL today. Might not be the best thing to do in production, but you
Right.
can do that right now,
And
right? Like out of your box,
it may not be what you're going to do in 6 months or a year
or
or
3 months or
2 years.
whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
But it helps you get started, right? And start to pave that way as you move forward. And that's a key role I think that we have to play here. And I think what it's helping, hopefully people see, we are much tighter aligned across the portfolio because of this, right? The
Mm-hmm.
linkages that we have in RHEL with OpenShift, with Ansible,
Mm-hmm.
how we pull all of that together is much tighter and being done on behalf of the value we can deliver, collectively as Red Hat to a customer.
Right. And I think, your point is spot on. I see it in my daily life, right? Like every week I talk to somebody in the Ansible
Yeah.
team and somebody in the Rail team. Every product, it feels like I talk to somebody on that team every week. And that's not because of the show or the TV channel. It's because of actual like work, right? Like, so we're all working together on making this, cloud or whatever data center experience you're going through a better experience, right? Like
Yeah.
technology exists to improve human life. And I feel like we get that here at Red Hat, right? It's not
Yeah.
to make your life harder, it's to actually make your life easier and better and more sustaining, you know. Are there any closing thoughts that you want to share? Like what is like the most, overlooked feature in RHEL that you think people should use, or any closing thoughts and before we wrap up here?
I think one thing that kind of ties a lot of the things that we talked about, Chris, is we talk a lot about at Red Hat. We talked about open hybrid cloud, 7 years ago. I
Mm-hmm.
think now when you look at the market, right, people throw out the term hybrid cloud, 16 ways to Sunday. I think one of the things that ties to the point you just made about making technology more cohesive is hybrid cloud used to be a simple term of I have on-prem, I have off-prem, I am now hybrid. I think now as a lot of the technologies we talked through are really about how the term hybrid, or the just pure definition of hybrid is that the hybrid is across really your entire stack at this point.
Right.
You could be hybrid at the architecture level. You're hybrid across which public clouds you use. You're hybrid across VMs and bare metal and containerization. You're hybrid across edge now in linkage with what I'm running in my data center. Hybrid is across all the spots. So it is not just about, on-prem and off-prem anymore. I think what we're trying to focus on as a portfolio is how do we bridge all of those layers of hybrid and whatever next layer of hybrid is going to come down the pipeline.
Right.
But how do we provide some access to all of those hybrid and some simplicity with how to run it and how to deploy it and how to manage it at scale? So that's really that to me is where our focus is, and RHEL has a core role to play in that, not just in what we can allow folks to do at an operating system level in bare metal or VMs or single containers or small containers, but
Mm-hmm.
how do we then bridge that technology and that ecosystem into the rest of the portfolio? So I'm super excited to be at kind of the the heart of this glue, right, that we try and deliver, and this kind of burgeoning world of hybrid. I think the hybrid cloud term is one of those moving targets that we're all going to be chasing. But that's the exciting part of it to me.
Yeah, like one of the last jobs I had before joining Red Hat, it was like, oh, we're all in on AWS. I'm like, wait. Our entire network is managed by something in Cisco's cloud. We're not all in on AWS, right? Like
Yeah.
those network people have to manage something completely different than AWS, and we have to help them, right? Like so, like the idea that you're all in any one place. I think the only place you could really do that is in your own data center. So even nowadays, right? Like your website probably pulls in stuff from multiple different clouds,
Yep.
right? Like, from
And
different
it may
CDNs and
change.
stuff. Yeah.
It may change tomorrow. It may change in a week, right? So it's really about how are you ready to be able to change with it, right?
Right.
And based upon the needs and
Can you evolve?
can you evolve? And I tell you, nothing has shown us that more than everything everyone has been through with COVID, right? It has
Right.
shown us all the unprecedented change that we all may have to be dealing with.
Mm-hmm. Well, Stefanie, thank you so
Yeah.
much for joining us today. Really appreciate your time. It was a wonderful, wonderful experience. I want to remind folks in 2 weeks, we'll be back with Satish, our VP of Managed Services here at Red Hat. So that'll be an interesting conversation to follow on after our conversation about managed services. And then coming up immediately after this is DevNation with talk about Istio, I think, Kubernetes, Istio, and telepresence. So that'll be super fun. So please stay tuned. And thank you again, Stefanie, for joining us.
My
And
pleasure. Good to talk with you, Chris.
good talking with you. And we'll see you soon, everybody. Bye.